Research Center located on Skinker, as well as the Soldiers Memorial Military Museum, which will be opening downtown on November 3rd. And I also hope you check out our website, which is mohistory.org. You can look at some of our collections, view the upcoming calendar of events, link to our blog, History Happens Here, and find lots of other great information about local history. I want to start with a great big thank you to St. Louis Polonia, who approached us about hosting this program. This evening's program would literally not be possible without them, so we're so appreciative of that, and in particular of Jarek Czernikovich, who put so much time and energy into this program, as well as other programs that will be taking place throughout the week. I want to acknowledge also the program sponsors who helped to make this evening possible. So a big thank you to the Reuben and Gloria Feldman Family Educational Institute at the Holocaust Museum and Learning Center, Washington University's Kemper Art Museum and the Departments of Art History, and Jewish, Islamic, and Near Eastern Languages and Cultures, Pillar Design Group, Inc., consulting structural engineers, AJC Global Jewish Advocacy, and the Shillong Art Conservation, Inc. Thank you all so much. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. First, I would ask that you please silence your cell phones. Also, you'll find a few things on the table outside the auditorium that I hope you take with you today. One is a selection of excerpts from the book Amazing Journey, Metamorphosis of a Hidden Child by Felicia Graber. Ms. Graber is a St. Louisan who is currently with the Holocaust Museum and Learning Center, but who was born in Poland during the war years and wrote about her experience as a child of the war, as well as an immigrant to the United States and life in St. Louis as well. Her memoir is part of our archives and collections at the Library and Research Center, so we wanted to share some pieces of that with you. You'll also find the calendar of events and exhibit information on the table out there. We work really hard to keep most of our programs and all of our exhibits free to the public. This is made possible in part through the Zoo Museum Tax District, and of course through our wonderful members and donors. So if we have any members in the room tonight, we sincerely thank you. And if you came with a member, say thank you to them, because they made these programs possible. And if you're not a member yet, but you like the kinds of things we do here, I hope that you might take some information about membership and consider supporting our mission in that way as well. And while you're taking things from the table, I'm going to ask you to also leave something there for us. On your way in, you should have received a brief survey. Those don't sit on a shelf. We really do use them to help guide the content and direction of our programming. So we really would appreciate your feedback on tonight's event, and thank you in advance for that. And like I said, you can just leave those on the table. And finally, I want to invite you to stay after the program for a light reception. We'll have some coffee and some Polish treats just outside the room in the atrium area, so please be sure to stick around for that. And at this time, I'm going to hand over the microphone to Dr. Frances Levine. She's the president of the Missouri Historical Society, and she's going to share a few words with you and introduce our speaker for the evening. So thank you again, and please welcome Frances Levine.
Thank you so much for being here. Tonight is a night of many firsts. I have to say that you are the first evening audience to occupy our newly renovated space. It was finished yesterday. And I'm thrilled because you all look so great that I'd like to take your picture. Okay, ready? How do you say cheese in Polish? What a great evening. As I say, it is an evening of firsts, you as our first evening audience. This is the first time that I'm aware of that we have collaborated with St. Louis Polonia. And I have to thank Jarek, I'm going to massacre your name, but I'm going to try it here. Jarek Czernikovich. I did it? That was really hard. When Scott Grash and Jarek called about this, I thought, why not? Why not? You know, one of the things that we do here at the Missouri Historical Society is talk about difficult subjects in history, talk about the memories that we all have to work so hard at in restoring and keeping alive. This is also the first night that I'm going to say that I have ever said the following sentence. I am Polish. It's true. My grandmother, Anna Żelazny, never would have said those words. Anna came to the United States in 1907. Her husband and their first child had come here in her husband came in 1905, and then she and their first child, Esther, came in 1907. They went on to build a life in Pennsylvania and New York and Connecticut. And Anna was probably the most important person in my life. But and my grandmother taught me so many things. She taught me to bake. She taught me to tolerate my curly blonde hair at a time when everybody else had straight Mary Travers hair. She taught me a lot, but when I would try to get her to talk about her life in Poland, she would shut down. And I once said to her, let's go to Poland. Shouldn't we go and visit Poland? And she said, I didn't leave anything there. And that was the end of the conversation. It wasn't until I was in my early 30s that I found out through our family history that her father and her brother, 5 sisters came to the US, but her father and brother returned to Poland, and they were killed in Kalushin. Did I say it right? I've just learned to say it. We always said Kalushin because she never taught us to say it the right way. I learned that they were killed in a Nazi attack on Kalushin. And so now I know why she didn't want to talk about it. But I have spent many years researching that life that she left, that history. And so I consider this another important first for bringing together a group of people with strong Polish identity, with strong Jewish identity, with a shared history and identity. So I'm just really thrilled to embrace and learn that Polish history along with all of the rest of you tonight. Rising from the rubble, creating the POLIN Museum of the History of Polish Jews is a really wonderful program and wonderful series of collaborations. Emily has named many of our collaborators. And the POLIN Museum is the only museum dedicated to restoring the memory of the civilization, of the culture created by Polish Jews over the course of a millennium. I have no idea how long my family had been in Poland. On the Russian side of my family, on the Ukrainian side, I have a rough idea of the timeline. I don't know if my family was there 50 years or 500 years. I hope I'll find that out someday. But the chief curator, Dr. Barbara Kirshenblatt-Gimblett, will talk tonight about creating the museum on the site of the Warsaw Ghetto and how the museum honors those who died and those who are remembered, how we remember that culture. Dr. Kirshenblatt-Gimblett, I'm sorry, I'm so good with Spanish. I can say anything in Spanish, any name. I'm not so good with German. I'm not so good with Polish, but I'll get there. Buenas noches. Buenas noches. Bienvenidos a su museo. Okay. Dr. Kirshenblatt-Gimblett is the chief curator of the core exhibition at the POLIN Museum of the History of Polish Jews. She's the professor emerita at New York University, where she was a professor of performance studies since 1981. She's a distinguished university professor, a title that she achieved in 2002. She's known for her interdisciplinary contributions to Jewish studies and to the theory and history of museums, tourism, and heritage. What a wonderful thing to have you here with us. She's authored a number of books, including Destination Culture, Tourism, Museums, and Heritage, and they called me Mayor July, Painted Memories of the Jewish Childhood in Poland Before the Holocaust. Her honors include a recognition of lifetime achievement by the Foundation for Jewish Culture, the Molotek Prize, for, Yiddish and Yiddish culture, and the Officer's Cross of the Order of Merit of the Republic of Poland for her contribution to POLIN Museum. She's been elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and she has served on the advisory board for the YIVO Institute of Jewish Research, the Council of American Jewish Museums, the Jewish Museum of Berlin, among others. And she really is going to talk with us tonight about creating this place of cultural memory. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kirshenblatt-Gimblett.
Thank you very much for that very moving introduction. And I too would like to thank all of the sponsors that have made this visit and this lecture tonight possible, but especially I want to thank Jarek Czernikiewicz, who initiated this invitation and who has brought together an extraordinary group of partners. And that collaboration, I believe, will have very positive repercussions for future projects and future collaborations. So it's my pleasure tonight to provide you with a kind of backstory, a curatorial, if you will, a curatorial tour of the core exhibition and the principles that we used in creating it. So let me begin by asking you, how many of you have visited Poland? Oh my goodness, we're preaching to the choir. And how many of you have visited POLIN Museum? Oh my word, in which case, I wasn't able to give you a tour of the exhibition in person, but I am going to really try to convey to you how we made the exhibition. And for those of you who have already seen it, I think this will be really quite interesting, and I'll look forward to your comments and your responses. So let me begin with the site. This is what the site where the museum stands today looked like after the liberation in 1945. After the Warsaw Ghetto uprising was suppressed by the Germans, they basically leveled the ghetto, and the ghetto stood in what had been the Jewish neighborhood before the war. It was home to the largest Jewish community in Europe. About a third of the population of Warsaw was Jewish before the war, so approximately, if it was a population of about 1 million, about a third is about 300,000 Jews. And so the idea that we rise from the rubble, I mean it quite literally, that literally this museum was built on the rubble of the Warsaw Ghetto and the pre-war Jewish neighborhood in the northern district in Warsaw known as Muranów. I was very moved in the response of Arnie Eisen, the chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary, the comments that he wrote after attending the grand opening of the core exhibition in the museum in October of 2014. It's not often that a museum makes history as well as chronicles it, and rare too when otherwise cautious observers remark at the opening of a new museum that it may prove a source of hope and pride that propels an entire society forward. Both of those things happened this week in Warsaw with the opening of POLIN Museum. Now that's really extraordinary, and the idea that a museum could prove a source of hope and pride that could propel an entire society forward, that is absolutely extraordinary, and it is, if you will, an aspiration that we dearly hope we can fulfill. The museum stands facing the monument to the ghetto heroes. This is an image from 1948, the 5th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. You can see the destroyed city of Warsaw in the background because a year later, in 1944, there was the Warsaw uprising, and the Germans destroyed about approximately 85% of the core of downtown, of the core, if you will, of the city of Warsaw. And here the rubble has not been cleared, and you can see the unveiling of the monument on that hill with huge procession, newsreel footage. It was actually an international event. Today, the monument stands in an area where the rubble had been cleared, and in the 50s and the 60s especially, communist-era apartment blocks were built. You can imagine, with the city so destroyed, that the housing shortage and the effort that was required to rebuild the city was absolutely enormous. And between 1948 and 2013, when we opened the building, and 2014, when we had the grand opening, the only marker that there had been this vibrant Jewish community in Poland and in Warsaw in particular, and the only indication that there had been the Warsaw Ghetto here was this monument. That was it. And it is absolutely iconic. In its time, it was monumental. Today, perhaps not so much so, although it's very, very resonant. And if one comes to Warsaw and has any interest whatsoever in the history of the Holocaust and in the history of Polish Jews, it is the place one must go to. But that was it. And so in 1993, it was determined that really it was time to recover the 1,000-year history of Polish Jews. And that was an idea that was sparked by the opening of the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. And that museum, several members of a Jewish NGO in Poland called the Association of the Jewish Historical Institute of Poland, several members had attended the opening of the Holocaust Museum in D.C. And they came away thinking, if there's a Holocaust Museum in Washington, there should be a museum of the history of Polish Jews in Warsaw. And so with that idea, the association began to really consider taking it on as a project, and the city of Warsaw allocated that orange block as the site of the future museum if by some miracle such a museum should ever be built, and it would face the monument to the ghetto heroes. And that is precisely what we were able to achieve between the idea in 1993 and the grand opening in 2014. Now, basically, our thinking was that the museum would complete the memorial complex, that you would go to the monument to honor those who died by remembering how they died, but you would turn around and go to the museum to honor them by remembering how they lived and how they lived for 1,000 years, and that in this way we would complete the memorial complex. And so what kind of a building should it be? And and its location, of course, was everything. So I'll say more about the building. The museum itself was a project until 2005, when the NGO approached the city of Warsaw and the Ministry of Culture and National Heritage and said, join us in founding this museum as a private-public partnership. And the city and the ministry agreed. And in 2005, they actually founded the museum, and they organized an international architectural competition for the building. And there were over 200 submissions, the greatest architects in the world, Daniel Libeskind, and many others. And the architects say that the best prize is second prize, because you get the prize and you don't have to build it. So, but I can assure you that Libeskind and others of these famous architects, that wasn't necessarily their thinking, but the winner was a Finnish architect, Rainer Mahlamaki. And I believe that I really feel like it took a Scandinavian, it took a Finnish architect to create a building that would be so modest on the outside. It would shimmering glass that would dematerialize the bulk of the building, that it would be geometric, that it would echo the form of the monument, that it would stand in a respectful relationship to the monument. And he did indeed. And the glass has silk screened on it the word POLIN, which I'll explain in a moment, in Hebrew letters and in Latin letters. And this glass is like the scales on a fish, and it reflects, it's full of, the building is full of light, transparency, it reflects every change in the lighting, the clouds, the shadows of the day. It's a very responsive, reflective, and beautiful surface. And the other side of the building, it's the largest glass window in Poland and the largest it's a hanging, suspended glass window, which lets in beautiful light. And the interior is where there's all the drama with these really astonishing, and I would say engineering feats to create these very organic forms on the inside. Now, the architects were told that they needed to provide a space for the exhibition. In fact, they were delivered the architectural plan, the master plan for the exhibition. And you enter the exhibition from the ground floor. Excuse me. You enter it from the ground floor. Now, if you remember the Rubble, you'll appreciate that we began with no historic building, and we began without a collection. And our greatest asset was, in fact, the story that we wanted to tell. That was our greatest asset. And we determined very early on that we would create a multimedia narrative exhibition that I like to think of as a theater of history, an immersive experience that would communicate the story through the way in which the space was organized and through a whole range of media that would be deployed in a way. It was as if you had entered as if we took down the fourth wall and the proscenium, and as if you had stepped, I think of the Purple Rose of Cairo, that take away that fourth wall and that you step on the stage and actually you are inside the story. That was the intention. And so this is, I'll come back to this image, but it's a good example of our theater of history approach. Now, of course, we used objects, but unfortunately, even if we had access to every object in the world relevant to the history of Polish Jews, they would not be adequate to the telling of this story. And I'll try and show that to you in just a moment. So here's the timeline. This unique private-public partnership for a major cultural institution is the first one and is truly unique. 1993 is the idea. The project starts in 96. The design for the core exhibition, the master plan, is completed by 2004. We found the museum in 2005 and have the competition for the building. We opened the building in 2013. We have the grand opening in 2014. We win the biggest European museum prizes in 2016. And this year, and we're not even finished with the year, we're only in October, we still have 2.5 months to go, we've had 2.5 million visitors. And most recently, our current temporary exhibition, which we just closed on the anti-Semitic campaign of March '68, we set a record for temporary exhibitions in Poland on a topic other than art. We had 117,000 visitors for that exhibition, and 2,000 visitors were queued up on the day before we closed to see the exhibition before it was gone. So in that, and I would say that in the beginning it was 70% Polish visitors, 30% international. Now it's about 50-50, and about half the international visitors are Jewish visitors from Israel and from the diaspora, and we have a pretty good idea of our visitors. And so, and that I think is really the criterion for judging, if you will, the success of the museum. I like to think that one of the strengths of our project is its intellectual coherence, that it's I like to think of it as an intelligent exhibition, an intelligent exhibition for a wide audience, from young children all the way to our seniors. And to give you a feel for the, if you will, what we call meta-historical principles, for the guiding principles that inform our approach to this history and our approach to the telling of this history across 1,000 years, let me run through a couple of them. And because I think we never state them as such, but you can feel them and come away intuitively knowing that they are guiding the story. So the first thing is, I'm often asked, what is the most important period in the history of Polish Jews? And usually when I'm asked, the person asking already knows. For some, it's the Holocaust. For others, it's the interwar years, like say the period that my parents grew up in Poland. For others, it's the post-war years. It's their period. It's the period they remember, and it was a period that was formative for them. Nobody ever says the medieval period, which is more than 500 years, more than half of our millennium. And early modern period, 19th century, our historians always complained that nobody was interested. Turns out it's not true. My answer to that question is always that the single most important period in the history of Polish Jews is 1,000 years, all of it. And that was the reason why I would never agree that the exhibition would be opened a gallery at a time. Out of the question. The message is that it's the 1,000 years of continuous Jewish presence in this territory. Jews were never expelled. They became the largest Jewish community in the world. They became a center of the Jewish world, and in the 18th century, half the Jewish population in the world was living in the territory of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. 1,000 years is the most important period. The second principle is that Jews are an integral part of the history of Poland, that they are not only in Poland, but also of Poland, that they were not, if you will, aliens that were isolated in these little sort of oases scattered across the country. No, they were not only in Poland, but also of Poland, and we have much evidence, and we try to really communicate that in the exhibition. The third is this, what I would call a spectrum of relations. The assumption here is that the dominant relationship in the history of Polish Jews is anti-Semitism. And that is, let me put it this way, there are two major approaches to the history of Polish Jews. The dominant one, the one that dominated in Poland for many, many years, was the idea that the history of Polish Jews is a history of Polish-Jewish relations. These are Polish historians working with Polish sources and Polish archives, and if you will, the relevant history, the relevant aspect of this history was Polish-Jewish relations, and generally what that meant was the negative, anti-Semitism. But there's a second, if you will, approach, which is the approach that we take, and that is that a history of Polish Jews is a history of Polish Jews, and Polish Jews as agents in their own history, and not simply objects on which others project their fantasies and fears. So what that meant was that we wanted to present what we called a spectrum of relations, a story of coexistence and conflict, of cooperation and competition, of separation and integration. And sometimes one of those terms is dominant, and other times the other term is dominant. We're not establishing any kind of equivalence. We're not suggesting that these are always weighed equally. But the idea of a spectrum of relations, because otherwise it's not possible to account for how this place could become home to the largest Jewish community in the world and a continuous presence for 1,000 years. Not possible. Polish Jews created a civilization that is, in the words of Moshe Rossman, a wonderful historian, categorically Jewish and distinctly Polish, and depending on the region, also Ukrainian, Lithuanian, Belarusian. Polish Jews became, as I said, the largest Jewish community in the world. And then there's the power of telling the story in the very place where it happened. Because quite often people would say to me, why are you making this museum in Poland? I think, well, why not? You know, do you ask that question about the Jewish Museum in Paris or Berlin or London? I said, well, where should we make it? They said, New York or Tel Aviv. I said, why? They said, because there are Jews there. I thought to myself, but this doesn't make sense. What makes sense, and those of you who have been know that there is nothing more powerful than to experience this story in the place. This is a site-specific museum, and that is very powerful. And finally, we're a site of conscience. Our goal is to create a trusted zone for engaging difficult subjects, and today more than ever. And so these are the principles that guided the exhibition, even though we never state them outright. So now what I'd like to do is to pick up on a few, if you will, moments in the exhibition and to suggest to you why we did what we did. What was the thinking? What was the reasoning behind it? So from the very beginning of the master plan, which was created by Event Communications, a wonderful design firm in London that specializes in the creating of multimedia narrative exhibitions, and the process of developing the core exhibition was led by Jerzy Halberstadt, who was the chief of the project between about 1996 and 2011. They always wanted us to begin with a forest. And why? Very counterintuitive. That we would begin this 1,000-year history not with an historical event, but with a legend, with a story that Jews told themselves about why they came to Poland, how they came to Poland, and why they stayed. And the legend actually is a beautiful, and I have to ask Jarek, who came up with the Bader? There's, in your little flyer, there's a beautiful version of the legend from a Yiddish version from Bader. And it's a version that we were working with. It's not the version we use. We use the version from Agnon. But I was stunned and delighted to see the Yiddish version presented in the little flyer that you have. So essentially, it's a story that Jews were fleeing persecution in the West. They came east, they found themselves in a forest, and they heard the words POLIN, which they thought was Hebrew, whether the birds were chirping or an angel's hand pointed, whatever it was, and they thought that the Hebrew said, "Po here, rest here, here you shall dwell." And they thought that it was divinely ordained that they should come to Poland and stay there until the Messiah comes and takes them to the land of Israel, which is a very long time. And so, starting with a story the Jews told themselves about how they came, and that it was a positive thing to come and a positive thing to stay. It's essentially a 19th century legend. This was how we started. We created a space of historical imagination that was, and we, if you will, the design solution was a poetic forest based on the wilderness forest in northeastern Poland. So when we come into the medieval gallery, we cross the threshold between legend and history. And here's where our 500-year medieval story begins. And it's a story, essentially, of how, from a few traveling merchants, starting with Ibrahim ibn Yaqub, a Sephardic Jew from Cordoba, sent by the Caliph on a diplomatic mission across Europe, and around 965, more or less, who left an incredible travel account. We start with, how do we get from a few traveling merchants, Jewish merchants, along the trade routes, passing through Poland? How do we get from there in the 10th, 11th, 12th century to 1500, where Jews are living in more than 100 places, with Jewish communities in more than 50 of them, and, well, the figures vary, but let's say, as a median figure, 15,000 Jews. How do we get from there? And by that time, how do we get to a point where the center of the Ashkenazi Jewish world is starting to shift from the Rhineland to Poland? How did that happen? That's what the medieval gallery tries to tell. Now, how are we going to tell it? What have I got? I got tombstones and coins. That's it. There are no artifacts, zero, no artifacts from the medieval period in Poland related to the history of Polish Jews from the 10th century to 1500, except tombstones. This is the earliest, 1203, and bracteates, these one-sided coins, some of them minted by Jews with Hebrew inscriptions. And those coins are not that big. They are the size of a dime. They are size maybe of a nickel. That's it. So what did we do? What was our curatorial solution, our design solution? We took the stories that we had from our sources, from rabbinical correspondence, chronicles, travel accounts. We took manuscript illuminations from Hebrew manuscripts from the Rhineland and from Christian manuscripts from our territory. We went to two of Poland's most celebrated comic book artists, and we said to them, illustrate these stories in the style of these manuscripts according to these periods from the 10th century to 1500. We then hired conservatories that specialize in the conservation of medieval, Baroque, and later churches in Poland, and we had them hand paint the walls and hand gild the sections on the royal relations wall using traditional gilding techniques and real gold, and we created a hand-painted gallery in this multimedia high-tech narrative museum, a hand-painted gallery. It is like stepping into a life-size, 360-degree illuminated manuscript. And so, in the absence of artifacts, with only coins and tombstones, we were able to tell this 500-year story and to really, I would say, create a really unique solution and completely handcrafted, which is a great tribute. In Poland, craftsmanship is alive and well. The craftsmanship in this museum is a very high standard. When Event Communication came to see the exhibition after it opened, they said that none of the exhibitions they've ever created anywhere met the standard of the quality of materials and craftsmanship that our Polish fabricators delivered to us. When we cross from the medieval gallery to the early modern period, we come to the period when Poland, that is to say the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, was one of the largest countries in Europe. And this is a period from 1569 to 1772, and it's often called a golden age in Poland, often considered a golden age for Polish Jews, because this is the period when half the Jewish population of the world was living in Poland, when Poland became the center of the Ashkenazi Jewish world, when Poland was known as a center of rabbinical learning and Hebrew and Yiddish printing, and when the Jewish community of the Commonwealth had an enormously high degree of, if you will, self-government, organizing of their own communities and running of their own affairs. And a key to the, I would say, effectiveness of this exhibition is our approach to, if you will, the way in which we tell the story. And it is an open-ended story. I like to say there's no master narrative, and that it is multi-voiced, that we work with primary sources and we only use sources from the period, not from later and not retrospective. Because one of the things that we are very conscious of is that the Holocaust tends to dominate the perspective on this 1,000-year history, as if the entire history was leading up inexorably to the Holocaust, which is not the case. And so to try to pull back on what I think of as this teleological drive to the Holocaust, we ask our visitors to stay in the historical present, in the moment of the story. And one of the ways we do that is by by narrating through quotations from primary sources in many voices from the period. And this is a wonderful example of just that. And so this is the map. This is the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. This is the territory that is today Poland, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, and also parts of Russia and the neighboring areas. And it is, the Ukraine had become part of Poland during the medieval period, and during this period of the Commonwealth, Lithuania and Poland joined together as a way of being stronger militarily. So how do we present this golden age from a Jewish perspective? One of the ways in which we do it is to, because it's very abstract to say the rise of rabbinical authority, and always we said to ourselves, how are we going to interest the 15-year-old Polish boy? He is our hardship case. And so we thought, and I in particular said, you know what? Printing presses. Let's create printing presses and encourage our visitors to actually print, and they're printing the Jewish printers' marks from the first Hebrew and Yiddish printers in the Commonwealth. And so, and people walk away with these printed printers' marks and also the title page of a book. They frame them, they hang them in their homes across the length and breadth of Poland. I don't think any of these Jewish printers would ever have imagined that their printers' marks would be hanging in these Polish homes. Now, of course, we show original objects. In the case of printing, we do show wonderful books printed in the Commonwealth in this period. But it doesn't speak to a visitor. You know, you say, great, you've got an original book. So how do you open those books up? We created a library using these lecterns that are very typical in the synagogue. And each lectern has a monitor where we are able to open those books up, including material that had never, ever been shown before. And in this case, a Kabbalistic scroll, which is, the Kabbalah is the Jewish mystical tradition. And this particular scroll is an extraordinary object. And we're able to not only show it, but also interpret it, translate it, and offer our visitors an opportunity for a kind of quick introduction to a very difficult, otherwise very difficult subject. The role of Jews in the economy is critical to understanding the emergence of a very distinctive form of Jewish settlement, which we call the Jewish town, and which we present in the second half of the Commonwealth period, which is interrupted by the Khmelnytsky uprising, the Cossack uprising in 1647, 1648. And this uprising, as a result of it, approximately a third of the Jewish population perished, and many Jews were forced to convert, and many also were forced to leave. But by the end of the period, which was really a century of war, Jews came back, the Commonwealth rebuilt itself, the nobility invited Jews to come back to the towns and to help to redevelop the economy, and in some cases even provide a loan for the building of the synagogue. And it's by the end of this century that we come to what we call the Jewish town. The Jewish town is essentially a town established according to German town law that has a central marketplace, that has a certain form of town governance based on a German pattern that was introduced during the medieval period. And we call it the Jewish town because, and they were largely private towns, although there were also royal towns and towns that belonged to the church, but overwhelmingly Jews were living in these private towns owned by the nobility. And where they settled, and this was their most characteristic form of settlement, they were often a very large proportion of the town. Could be 30%, 40, 60, 70, 80, even 90%. In the case of my father's town of Opatów, during the interwar years, a town of 10,000, 65% were Jewish. Białystok, before the Second World War, the proportion fluctuated, but 50%, even 60, 70% was Jewish. Białystok, it's a city, it's not even a town. If you could imagine St. Louis, 60% Jewish or 70% Jewish. It's really hard to imagine, but this was very, very characteristic of the pattern of Jewish settlement. And so here, the two poles of Jewish life are the synagogue, well, the marketplace, which is definitely a zone of profound interaction of Jews and non-Jews. We try to present Jewish women's piety in the context of the home. We are probably the only Jewish museum in the world that has a church. Although I had some Israeli visitors arrive, because we look at the changing relationship of the church and the Jews. I had some Israeli visitors arrive, and they said they didn't realize it was a church. I thought to myself, how can you not realize it's a church? It's so obvious. And then a colleague of mine said, oh, but Barbara, there's no cross in your church. I said, well, we couldn't go that far. So, but the idea that the relationship of Jews and the church really changed during this early modern period, and especially in the 17th and 18th centuries. So there are two, if you will, centers of gravity. The marketplace, which we surround with the tavern, which is another whole story, because with the collapse of the grain industry after the century of war, there was a glut of grain in the Commonwealth, and they had to increase domestic consumption. And the best way to increase domestic consumption was to convert grain to alcohol. And the alcohol industry, the production, distribution, and sale of alcohol was largely in Jewish hands, including inns, taverns, and more widely. And so the tavern is a very important aspect. So the tavern, the home, and the church are these moments, if you will, around the marketplace. But the second center of gravity is the synagogue, and, if you will, new currents in Jewish religious life during this period, messianic yearnings, a popularization of the Jewish mystical tradition of the Kabbalah, the emergence of new Jewish religious leaders and movements that then really come into their own in the 19th century. And so what were we going to do? And we decided that one of the great, if you will, objects, one of the great expressions of this symbiosis, of this, if you will, categorically Jewish, distinctly Polish, Ukrainian, Belarusian, Lithuanian, one of the most beautiful expressions of it is the wooden synagogue. Now, there were hundreds of wooden synagogues across the length and the breadth of the Commonwealth during the 16th, 17th, 18th century, really up until World War II. And during World War II, the Germans destroyed every single one that was still standing. There are none of these great, of the great wooden synagogues, not one is standing. There is, however, one, the one that once stood in Gwoździec, which is today in Ukraine, that was actually destroyed during World War I when the Russian front moved through Gwoździec and there was a fire and the synagogue burned down. However, it is also the single best documented of all the wooden synagogues. And so we decided that we would take the Gwoździec synagogue as our inspiration. And we turned to the documentation, to hundreds of drawings and photographs made by Alois Breyer, a Viennese architectural historian, cutaways, cross-sections, floor plans, everything imaginable, plus photographs of the interior. None of them, I mean, he did make color studies. He made a color study of a segment of the painted interior and of the bima, of the reader's desk. And a Kaufmann, also a wonderful painter working in Vienna, he actually painted this section of the interior of this synagogue. So we had a color reference. So what did we do? We worked with a marvelous studio in Massachusetts called Hans House Studio. They are a nonprofit educational studio that is dedicated to, this is their mission statement, to recover lost objects. That's their mission. And what they say is, you could never recover a lost object in the sense of recovering the material object, the materials, an object with its original materials. But you can recover the knowledge of how to build it by building it using traditional tools, materials, and techniques. And they had done that in other projects, and they decided to use that principle here. So what did they do? They assembled, and together with us, we together assembled a team of approximately 300 volunteers and experts, timber framers and architectural historians and Jewish historians and art historians. We collaborated with a Skansen, an open-air folk architecture museum in the south of Poland, outside of Sanok, and they allocated this area. We ordered 200 raw logs with the bark still on. We collaborated with the Timber Framers Guild of America and timber framers in Europe, who arrived with their historical adzes and lathes and pit saws, and they brought their tools in ski bags and golf bags. I don't know how they ever got them on the airplane. It was Lord of the Rings. And they'll go anywhere where there's timber framing, and they know how to use these traditional tools. And in 3 two-week workshops with our volunteers and our experts, we completed the timber framing for the roof and the ceiling of the Gwoździec synagogue. And we numbered all the parts. We took the whole thing apart. We then stacked it under a tarpaulin, and it sat there for 2 years until we were ready to bring the parts to the museum, to stack them in the basement, on the ground, the lower level, reassemble it, and hoist this structure in place, suspend it from cables. It's 25 tons. And it is suspended. And you can see it very well from the main floor, and you see from underneath, you'll see the painted ceiling. The painted ceilings, we divided the ceiling into 8 segments, and each segment, we completed it with a team of volunteers, approximately 20 volunteers and experts, in a 2-week workshop in an existing masonry synagogue in Poland, in Wrocław, in Sejna, in Rzeszów, in Szybczeszyn, in Kazimierz Dolny, in Kazimierz Krakow, in Warsaw. And then we brought the painted segments of the ceiling to Warsaw, and we installed them, and this is what you see today. And it is, and of course we did the bima the same way. The bima, the ceiling is 85% scale, and the bima, the reader's desk, is the platform, rather, is about 100% scale. There's a whole range of things about it to be said, but I would say that it is probably the single most memorable experience for anybody visiting the museum. And what I love most are the kids. We have a kind of cushion for the kids, and it's got 2 straps. So when they're walking around the museum, they wear it like a backpack, except they look like little turtles, with this on their back. But when they come here, we invite them to lie down and just look up. And I think to myself, they'll come back with their kids, and they'll say, I remember when I was a kid, and I came to the museum to see this. And on the upper level, you can see the timber framing, but also all the interpretation, the original materials. And I'm just stunned that these kids are showing each other what's going on and exploring the map that shows all the places. And so we come to the 19th century, and that enormous red map that we saw, that enormous red map is torn, if you will, and that huge Commonwealth, which was extraordinarily diverse. It was home to Catholics and Protestants of every denomination, to Orthodox Catholics, Jews, Tatars, Muslims. It was extraordinarily diverse in terms of religion, language, culture, and it was a kind of republic of nobles, so also very decentralized, and it was considered for the period exemplary for its religious toleration, for religious tolerance, because religion, in fact, was the single most important differentiating element in terms of all of the various factors. And so the Commonwealth was divided among Prussia, Russia, and Austria. And for the next Well, if you count from 1772, approximately the next 140 years, Jews are now living, and everybody else are now living under new regimes. But we keep the map, that red map, as a kind of, it's like a kind of palimpsest. We keep that red map in play underneath the new map, which is the section that's in Prussia, the section that's in Russia, and the section that's in Austria. And we ask ourselves, how did Jews respond to the challenges and their encounters with modernity, with all the new rules and regulations that were attempts to reform Jewish life, to, if you will, make them useful citizens, to reform their way of dress, to reform the role of the rabbi, to reform marriage age, education, language, and much else. And we also look not only at, if you will, personal responses, but also organized responses. And one of my favorite examples is the modern yeshiva. And when my historian said there are 3 organized responses that we have to present of, if you will, Jewish responses to the challenges of modernity. One is the Jewish Enlightenment. Okay, that I understand. One is the incredible rise and development of Hasidism, a Jewish mystical movement. I get that too. And the third is the rise of the modern yeshiva. I said, the 15-year-old Polish boy, how am I going to get him interested in the rise of the modern yeshiva? I'm not very interested in the modern yeshiva. So, of course, that wasn't a very smart thing to say to these historians. So I said, okay, I trust your judgment. Give me the material. So they said to me, we have no photographs, no objects, no paintings, no images. So at this point, I'm thinking to myself, this is really, really hopeless. So they said, but you know what? There is one of our colleagues, his student is doing a PhD on the rise of the modern yeshiva in the Lithuanian part of the Commonwealth. Let's ask him to do some research for us, and we'll, and what we normally ask for is go to memoirs, go to autobiographies, go to firsthand accounts from the period, and bring us some quotations that will communicate something about the experience. This material came, and I was stunned. I couldn't believe the descriptions. I tell you, if the pedagogy, never mind Jewish day schools, if the pedagogy in schools today was anything like the charismatic, dynamic question and answer and challenge and engagement of students in these modern yeshivas in the early and mid and late 19th century, we would have, it would be the ultimate experience. So once we had that, the event communications said, look, your only option is to create an animation, to make a film. And I thought to myself, Disney, no way in this exhibition, no way. So what we did was we had one memoir that basically communicated the 24-hour cycle of life in the first of these yeshivas, the yeshiva of Volozhin. And so that's what we did. We created 24 hours in the yeshiva of Volozhin in 4 minutes and 65 seconds, something along those lines, literally from dawn to dawn. How did we do it? We cast live actors, we painted them, we filmed the scenes in a green room, because then you can insert it into the computer-generated scenography. And we basically then, if you will, populated the interior of because in fact the actual building of this particular yeshiva is still standing, although none of the interior is there. And we then essentially told this 24-hour story. And it's narrated completely from this one particular memoir of 24 hours and the experience of the study of Torah as something so compelling, and the sense that the whole world stood and depended on this commitment and this 24-hour dedication to study. So, and it is a very, very memorable and wonderful film. And we wanted to be in the style of a 19th century painting. And so we gave some examples to the people who were designing this, and they used it to create a feeling that it was a 19th century painting. When the film was finished, we projected the film on canvas and refilmed it. So actually you can see the weave of the canvas when you see the film. So it's a bit like the medieval gallery. That is, necessity is the mother of invention, and some of the most memorable experiences were really solutions to radical situations of not having what you would expect or hope to have. We come to the middle of the 19th century to our multimedia train station, where the pace of change speeds up, the role of the railroad, industrialization, urbanization, migration of populations to the city, massive social change, and the development of modern Jewish political and social movements, the emergence of modern Hebrew and Yiddish culture and literature, not film, but theater, and also, of course, the rise of modern anti-Semitism, particularly around the wave of pogroms in the 1880s, the story of emigration, and so there's a kind of long 19th century and a big story to be told after the mid-century, which ends essentially with World War I, the breakup of the empires, and then we begin the post-World War I story and the emergence of the Second Polish Republic. 2018 is, in fact, the 100th anniversary of what's expressed in Poland as Poland's regained independence, the Second Polish Republic. And it's a short period. It's only 2 decades, the 1920s and the 1930s, but it's a very rich period. It's a period of great economic difficulty. You can imagine what the country was like after the First World War. Also the challenge of taking parts, that is, to create a country out of parts that were for 120, 140 years in 3 different other countries and making one unified Second Polish Republic out of those 3 parts. It's like Humpty Dumpty put back together again. So we decided to create a kind of interwar years street, which is a white relief facade on which we have projected actual, if you will, slices from pre-war streets, and then to create 4 thematic areas. We created one area called politics, looking at the 3 political parties that in a sense won from all the range of options that were emergent in the 19th century, meaning Zionism, the Aguda, the religious party, and the Bund, the Jewish labor movement. We create a timeline that takes us from, I would say, 1918 to 1939, that really also traces the rise of virulent anti-Semitism towards the end of the period. The second big area is culture and the emergence of a very vibrant Yiddish culture in this period. One has to remember that during the interwar years, approximately 40% of the country was, I would say, 10% was Jewish. The largest minority was Ukrainian. There were Belarusians, Germans, and many other groups. So between 30 and 40% were not Catholic, ethnically Polish. And so it was, in a sense, a tension between Poland as a state of nations and Poland as an ethnic state. That kind of tension was at play. But the minorities in Poland were successful in lobbying for the minority treaties to be appended, the minority, if you will, clauses to be appended to the Treaty of Versailles, the peace treaty for World War I. Although it was better on paper than it was in practice, at least theoretically or legally, these minorities had the right to have their own schools in their own language. And in fact, there was a great Yiddish school system as well as a Jewish school system of gymnasia in Polish, a religious school system, the Tarbut system for the Zionists, and really a flourishing of culture and a vibrant political life despite rising anti-Semitism and economic hardship. And there was, in addition, a very, I would say, the development of a new generation, the first generation to go to Polish public schools. In fact, more than 90% of Jewish children in Poland during the interwar years went to Polish public schools. They may have gone also to, and many, and I think most, went to a Jewish after school. And the reason is that the Jewish schools were private schools, and not everyone could afford to send their kids to a Jewish day school. And so we present the story of growing up and generational conflict, because the changes were so radical that when you look at family photographs, you can really see this generational change. And one of the areas is the courtyard, And in the courtyard, I was able to incorporate the toys that my father remembered making when he was a child growing up in Poland during the 1920s and 30s. And of course, the school system was a great, great, great point of pride. Now, it's here in the Interwarrior Gallery, as we approach September 1st, 1939, that it's so critically important to us that our visitors not anticipate the Holocaust. We work very, very hard to, that when you look down the street, you don't look and see the German invasion of Poland and the, if you will, official beginning of World War II with September 1st. What you see are people looking up. And it is a Julian Bryan photograph taken in the first week after the Germans invaded Poland. And this is the American ambassador and his staff standing outside the American embassy getting ready to evacuate. And it's only when you turn the corner and you look up that you see the bombs falling on Warsaw. And so we begin the Holocaust Gallery with September 1st, 1939, the German invasion of Poland, and we tell the story within the borders of occupied Poland because every gallery in the entire exhibition unfolds within the borders of whatever it was that Poland was at that time, which it gives us the ability to locate the story, even though the history of Polish Jews is really a transnational story, and that transnational aspect is something we try to bring out, maybe not as much as I would have liked to. Were I to do this again, it would be a much stronger element. But in any event, that's what we do for the Holocaust Gallery. What that means is that the rise of Hitler and Kristallnacht and all of those events that precede September 1st, 1939 are an interwar year story, and they are not the dominant story of the interwar years in terms of the presentation of Jewish life in Poland. I mean, there are books, for example, Celia Heller has a book, I think is On the Edge of Destruction. Polish Jews were not on the edge of destruction. They had no crystal ball. Nobody saw the Holocaust coming, not even Roman Vishniak, who claims that he did. Nobody saw it coming. In fact, the invasion on September 1st, 1939 came as a surprise to the Polish public. They were out in the countryside. They were at the ocean, at the sea. They don't have an ocean, they have a sea. They were at the sea. When the announcement came that the Germans invaded, they had to come back. They had to come home. So it was very important for us, this idea of staying in the historical moment, of staying in the historical present, of narrating in the first person, and of, if you will, interrupting or, if you will, pulling back on this teleological drive that makes the Holocaust the prism through which to see this history, whether it's a backshadowing or a foreshadowing, and which we worked very hard to avoid. And so once inside the Holocaust Gallery, we begin with separation, isolation, and we've organized the entire Holocaust Gallery around the principle of imposed reality and Jewish response. And we're able, by doing that, we're able to really leverage an extraordinary resource, which I'll explain in just a moment. But, and so, the separation, isolation, it's humiliation, it's marking, it's plunder, it's a separation in terms of side of the street, parks, where Jews, public transportation. But the ultimate expression of separation, of course, is the development of ghettos. And since we're on the site of the Warsaw Ghetto, we're a site-specific museum. When it comes to that ultimate expression of isolation, we take the Warsaw Ghetto as our pars pro toto, which is also our approach, not to create any kind of synthetic ghetto or a synthetic synagogue or synthetic yeshiva, but rather to allow a part to stand for the whole and to present it in a way that does communicate something larger than itself. Now, in the case of the Warsaw Ghetto, you can see that little area. That little area represents about 2% of the city of Warsaw, and a third of the population of Warsaw was forced into 2% of the space. So you can imagine it averaged 7 people per room, to give you a sense of the concentration of Jews in the ghetto. It was not only Warsaw Jews that were forced into the ghetto, but also Jews from the surrounding area. At its peak, there were 400,000 Jews in that little tiny area. When we enter the Warsaw Ghetto section of the story of the Holocaust as it unfolded in occupied Poland, we have an extraordinary resource. And here you can also see our multi-voiced approach to narrative. On the right is Adam Chernyakov, who was head of the Jewish Council, which the Germans had set up to run the ghetto and to administer it and to basically implement their orders. And on the left is Emanuel Ringelblum. He was a labor Zionist, which explains in part why he was writing in Yiddish. And both of them kept diaries. Chernyakov kept a diary in Polish, and Ringelblum kept a diary in Yiddish. And Ringelblum, who was an historian by training, he organized a project, if you will, a team called Oinik Shabbos, which means Joy of Sabbath. It was their code name. And this group of approximately 40 people, in secret, documented everything that was going on in the Warsaw Ghetto. And they collected everything. Everything from ration tickets, candy wrappers, to autobiographies, memoirs, diaries, reports, letters, postcards, posters, everything. And they, I would say, during the Great Deportation, in the summer of 1942, when they realized they wouldn't survive, they packed up the archive into those tin boxes. And they buried those tin boxes on Novolipki Street in the hope that if they didn't survive, the archive would. And then, a few weeks before the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, a year later, they realized this was the absolute end, and they buried the rest of the archive, particularly the archive that those who survived the deportation. There were about 60,000 Jews who survived the deportation, and the ghetto had become a kind of labor camp. They packed the archive in those milk cans, and they buried it. Right after the war, there were 3 people from that Oinik Shabbos team that survived, and they went out into that ocean of rubble, and they managed to find the first cache, the tin boxes of that archive, and to pull it out. In the 1950s, when they were clearing the rubble and excavating to build these apartment blocks, by accident, the earth-moving equipment unearthed the second cache with the milk cans, and the second cache of the archive was revealed. There's a thought that there is a third cache, but we've never been able to find it. And we thought it was under the Chinese embassy in Poland today. And they'd actually let us excavate, believe it or not. But it's not clear that, was there a third cache? Even if we were to find it today, it would be so deteriorated. So from the Warsaw Ghetto, after the uprising, we take our visitors into an area we call the Aryan Street, which is where we look at Polish-Jewish relations in the war. And there, too, we look at a spectrum of relations. We look at the very worst, the schmaltzovniks, the blackmailers, the betrayers. We look at the very best, those who risk their lives and the lives of their families to save Jews. And we look at a very, very wide range of responses in between those 2 extremes. And one of the ways we develop this is through actual first-hand accounts, stories of Poles who hid Jews. We have a whole section on hiding, whether it's in convents or it's individuals, some with a positive ending, some with a devastating ending. And so there's quite a, I would say, thoughtful, nuanced approach to Polish efforts to hide Jews, including organized efforts in the case of Żegota, which was a department of the Polish underground state that was specifically, and it was unique in all of occupied Europe, that there should be a department, an official department that was dedicated specifically to helping to save Jews. So we deal with that, and then of course we come to the Shoah proper and the deportation of Jews to the death camps, and basically we end the Holocaust Gallery with a presentation of Treblinka, which is where the Warsaw Jews were largely sent, and Auschwitz, where European Jews were largely sent. And we stop it right there, and then we pick up the story and ask ourselves what the world knew. We present Jan Karski, his efforts to communicate to, his futile efforts indeed, to communicate to the world what was happening in Poland, and try to understand how basically, though there's a whole series of those efforts, and why it was that somehow they fell on deaf ears. Then, of course, we come to the post-war years. And I don't think when I began working on the project that I realized that this would be the single most challenging chapter. First of all, there were colleagues and stakeholders and interested people who said, well, some of them said the whole museum should just be the Holocaust. Well, actually, the most extreme was the whole museum should just be empty. It should be a void. Well, that was a bit extreme. The next extreme was it should only be the Holocaust. The next extreme was it should only be just before the Holocaust, just after. And the next extreme was the whole story should end with the Holocaust. But that was absolutely a non-starter. And the post-war years is, well, on the one hand, I would say that it is the least known chapter in this 1,000-year history. That is to say that I would say that our Polish visitors know it very well as the history of post-war Poland, but they don't know the Jewish experience. They don't know the Jewish, if you will, the history of Polish Jews in the post-war period. And as far as our Jewish visitors go, they don't have a clue. They figured the story ended with the Holocaust. There is no story to tell. But it's an incredible story and a very difficult one, and the one that is most controversial, I would say, for a whole range of reasons we can discuss. So the first is look at the map. The blue line, that blue line is that represents the borders of the Second Polish Republic, the 1920s and 30s, the blue line. The red line represents the post-war Poland. Now, what happened here? What happened here is that on the right of the map, on the east of the map, in that sort of beige area, all of that area was returned to Lithuania, Belarus, and Ukraine. So what happened to all the Poles, all the Polish citizens, all the pre-war Polish citizens, Jews and non-Jews, what happened to all those people? They were repatriated to Poland. They were moved out of that beige area. Now, the yellow area, what's that? Those are the parts of Germany that were given to Poland, and the Germans were expelled from that yellow area, and all those Polish citizens that were in the beige area, many, many of them, were encouraged to settle in this now empty yellow area. So that means Lower Silesia, for example. So the post-war history is a history of changing borders, the relocation of populations, the creating of mono-ethnic states. It's a story of emigration. It's a story of communism. It's a story of, in quotation marks, assimilation. And it's a story of the creating of a new country with new borders and a very new configuration. And so when we bring our visitors into the post-war gallery, we bring them into essentially the rubble. We bring them into what is, for many of them, for Polish Jews, for many of them, was a huge cemetery. And the biggest question they asked themselves was, should we stay or should we leave? And so we've organized the entire gallery, that when you come into the gallery, on your right is the story of those who left, and on your, and on your left is the story of those who stayed. And those are in a kind of contrapuntal relationship with each other. The overwhelming story is a story of leaving. But those who stayed, and even those who stayed while planning to leave, were reconstructing their lives, were trying to restore justice, were trying to, if you will, recover dignity, were trying to commemorate, if you will, the Holocaust, and we present, of course, the story of the monument and the unveiling of the monument with the original newsreel footage, which is in Yiddish, which is really marvelous to hear. And then right opposite it, we present the story of leaving. And a critical, iconic event is an event on July 4th, 1946, which is the pogrom in the city of Kielce. But it was, although it's iconic, it wasn't the only case of violence against Jews, mainly between 46 and 48. It was a period of great instability in Poland. Poland was not fully demilitarized. There were people with guns, with weapons. There was banditry. There was pillaging, looting. There was a lack of housing, of food. It was a very unstable period, but for Jews, even more so. And so we not only present the Kielce pogrom, but on the right, we present various forms of violence, train violence, other forms of violence on the right, town by town by town by town, and we give our visitors an opportunity to look at the primary sources that actually really account in a very historically precise way. But what's very special about our presentation is that we present it only from the perspective of the period. using only sources from the period. No Jan Gross, no Jan Grabowski, none of the current debates. That for us is a post-'89 story. Here we present, from the documents of the period, what did the underground say? They blame the communists. What do the communists say? They blame the underground. What did the Bishop of Kielce say? He blamed the Jews. And what did what we call the moral voice, sort of an independent voice, say? They basically took Polish society to task. How could we as a society allow such a thing to happen? And so it's these multiple points of view. There were visitors from Facing History, a wonderful group that organizes and orchestrates conversations around difficult histories. And one woman said to me, "What? You presented those 4 perspectives from the time?" She said, "And you take the chance that your visitors will create their own errant narratives?" You know, their own errant, I thought that was very literary, their own errant narratives, their own mistaken narratives. I said, yeah, I'll take the chance. I'd rather take that chance than impose a kind of, tell them what they should think. And I also believe there's a way in which the visitors go through a process of self-correction through conversations also with each other, with our docents and with our educators. And so the story continues on the side of staying. Dosnaya Leben was the name of a newspaper, and efforts to reconstruct Jewish life, which came to a halt under Stalinism, and the, if you will, closing of Jewish independent organizations and the creating of one legitimate organization, the Social Cultural Association of Polish Jews. We bring the story forward along the leaving wall of the ways of emigration, along the staying wall of life under communism, and of course the leaving culminates with the exodus of March '68. This year, 2018, is also the 50th anniversary of the state-sponsored anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic campaign of March '68, precipitated by the Six-Day War and the Soviet bloc siding with the Arabs and the claim that Jews in Poland were, if you will, a fifth column, that if they had divided loyalties. All of this was a result of internal power struggle within the Communist Party, as well as an attempt to discredit a student protest movement protesting against censorship by blaming, if you will, Jewish agitators. So the politics around it led to this campaign. It was the first time that the state had used mass media, in this case not just newspapers or radio, but actually television, to mount this campaign. And as a result of the approximately 20,000 Jews that were left, but to give you the numbers, approximately 90% of Polish Jews were murdered in the Holocaust. Most of those who survived by deportation. They survived in the Soviet Union. The post-war Jewish population right after the war was approximately 250,000, of which about 50,000 had survived in concentration camps and come back, or survived in hiding. Hiding out of 3,300,000 Jews living in Poland before the Holocaust, to have 25,000 survive by hiding. It was clear that hiding was not a way to survive. And so of the 20,000 that were left by '68, approximately 13,000 emigrated, and they emigrated under the most humiliating circumstances. They had to give up their citizenship, give up their passports, leave on a one-way travel document, and from their perspective, never to return. But I would say today, of course, that's been completely reversed. But at the time, it was absolutely devastating, because by '68, these were people who had decided to stay in Poland, who identified with Polish language, Polish culture, who felt themselves to be fully a part of the country. And it was for them humiliating and devastating to be forced to leave under these circumstances. We come to 1989 and the fall of communism, and here we look at the renewal of Jewish life on a small scale. And this renewal is really very, very important, and continues today in all kinds of very, 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 very interesting ways. And when we come here, we've come full circle, because on the other side of this projection, in fact, is the forest. And this is the first time that we use video interviews. There are no video interviews in the Holocaust Gallery. There is no survivor testimony in the Holocaust Gallery. Everything in the Holocaust Gallery is from the moment, from the place, in the words of those who were there then. And it's only here, when we're in the present moment, that we have interviews. And we asked a series of questions. Is there a future for Jews in Poland? Is there anti-Semitism in Poland? Is Judaism, religion important? Is Israel important to you? But and who can make Jewish culture? That was the other one. But the question that came to me as a total surprise, the most interesting question, a question I would never think to ask and had never thought to ask anywhere, was, did you always know you were Jewish? And when people ask how many Jews there are in Poland, the best answer is from the chief rabbi, Rabbi Shudrik. He says, I don't know how many Jews are in Poland. All I know is the number increases, but the birth rate doesn't go up. And it's not about migration. And finally, we're hoping in the central circulation space to tell our story, your story and my story, which is to say, the story of Jews who left and the lives that they created in the places where they made their new homes, and the legacy of Polish Jews that they took with them, because it's estimated that about 70% of Jews in the world have their roots in the territory of that red map of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and theirs and ours is a really great story. Thank you very much. So I'm hoping that we have a couple of minutes for questions, because I know we have time for reception, so.
We do. I'm
Yeah,
going to come
great.
around with a microphone. I've got someone down here. And our time is short, so I'm going to ask everyone to keep it to one question, please.
Well, thank you very much. It was tremendously eloquent and smart and intelligent. It was fantastic. I only regret that when I visited there, you were not guiding me. And,
You have to come back.
And next time you will definitely guide me there. I just want to ask, visiting Poland Museum was fantastic. I felt embraced by the place. I thought that I was a actor in those 1,000 years. It was fantastic. It's a great museum. My question is, given the rising anti-Semitism in Europe, in Poland, do you think that the presence of this museum is helping the larger community? What's the impact of this museum in the psyche of the current Polish citizen?
Okay, let me ask this. Would you like to collect a few questions and have me answer them as a group so that more people get to ask? Or do you want me to do one by one?
At this point, let's do one.
Okay, one by one, okay. So, I would say that, well, first of all, we're in Warsaw. Warsaw's not the periphery. The current right-wing government, their base is really from the provinces. It's particularly from the eastern part of Poland, where there is really economic underdevelopment. You have a lot of youth unemployment. These are areas that are very conservative, very, very Catholic. And so, in that way, and Warsaw is a big city, and Poland's like 39 million people. We've had 2.5 million visitors, and a significant part of them are international. Like, where's everybody else? Where are they? And we're hoping, of course, and we try and bring, more and more visitors, not just from Warsaw, but from around the country. But Warsaw's somewhat exceptional. So in a sense, those who are coming to our museum are already more or less with us, So, for instance, one of the responses I love the best is when a Polish visitor leaves and says with some satisfaction, this is a museum of Polish history. That is an incredible statement, to recognize the history of Polish Jews as a museum of Polish history. I think that's it's a tribute to that visitor, and it's a tribute to us as well. So the first thing is that this, how can I say, I would say that, well, let me do it another way. Right now, the Minister of Culture, is not too happy with us. And why? He says that museums should promote good feelings and not produce or not create conflict. And one of the senators who was holding him to task for not taking control over our museum, which he can't because it's a private-public partnership, said to him about a new museum that the minister is proposing to create, a museum of the Warsaw Ghetto, which he's proposing to create and has already said what the story will be. He said it will be the story of the love of two nations, the Museum of the Warsaw Ghetto. Well, clearly it's not Jews and Germans, and it's not Germans and Poles, so I guess it must be Poles and Jews. So the senator that held him to task said to him about this new Museum of the Warsaw Ghetto, Mr. Minister, what kind of a museum will it be? Will it be a traditional museum that tells a neutral history? In other words, that's what it should be. Or will it be a modern museum like POLIN Museum where history is a starting point for debate? Which it shouldn't be. So, in terms of this current government's perspective, our museum is, quote, too political. But we're able to do what we do because we're a private-public partnership. So what does it mean? It means that when we went to the ministry and asked for money for the March 1968 exhibition, the ministry said no. They said, we don't like the title of the exhibition. In Polish, it's Obce w domu, which I asked them to translate as estranged. It means literally aliens or strangers at home. But I said, call it estranged, meaning a process. People who belonged, who feel that they have been estranged. And at March 68 in its aftermath, they said, Poles and Jews always got along. What do you mean estranged? Then they said, and who's on the organizing committee for the conference? Obviously, they wanted to make sure that the historians that they approve of would organize it or would be part of that committee. And so when they refused to fund it, the Jewish NGO, the Association of the Jewish Historical Institute of Poland, raised the money for the exhibition. It meant that we had a degree of autonomy that many other, and we are a state museum now, that many other museums don't have. And our museum has actually stood up. I mean, to give you another example, the March 68 exhibition, that one created an enormous debate and discussion, not only in the press, but in the Polish parliament. Can you imagine Congress, in the Senate, in the House of Representatives, that there should be a huge debate about an exhibition? It's unimaginable. But because in Poland there's something called historical policy, it's of a very particular kind, there was huge debate about this exhibition. And what was the most controversial part of this exhibition was the final section, which was a section that presented quotations from the media, from politicians, public figures, from the television, radio, newspapers, from, I would say, internet sites that are not crazy sites, but legitimate sites, statements that are virtually identical today to the ones that were made in March 68. And that was very, very controversial. And there was a whole scandal around that. So what I would say is that this museum has a degree of independence, not total, but a degree of independence, a degree of autonomy, to be able to stand up and to take a stand around really difficult subjects, and to do so in a way that attracted the largest number of visitors for any exhibition of this kind in the history of Poland, 117,000. That is amazing, amazing. So does it make a difference? We reach hundreds of thousands of Polish school children a year. We reach tens of thousands of Israeli kids. We reach March of the Living. And so what are the shifts that we're after? One of the shifts is that the history of Polish Jews includes the Holocaust, but is not the whole story, nor is it the defining story of the history of Polish Jews. That's huge. That is enormous. It's important, especially from my point of view, for our Jewish visitors, but also, I think, generally. That would be one. The second, that this is a story of more than anti-Semitism, but anti-Semitism is part of it. And we deal in a way that is honest and forthright and direct with that issue, but we deal with it in a way that is historically responsible, thoughtful, sensitive, nuanced, and fair. We like to think that we can model what civil debate looks like, what a reasonable conversation looks like. And I think it's hard to know how to measure the impact, But I think my answer would be yes, it's happening. But measuring it, I can't.
Yes, I wanted you to define a couple of terms for me. What was the diaspora, and what is Zionism?
Okay, you know, I would appreciate if I could talk with you about that afterwards, because those are big questions, and maybe we'll move on.
I was in Warsaw several years ago, toured some of the war and Holocaust-related sites, the Museum of the Uprising, what was purported to my group as being a recreated part of the ghetto itself. Where is this museum located in relation to those items? Is it near, is it far, different part of town completely?
It's actually near, and what's more, we collaborate on commemorating the uprisings. So for the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, we send up beams of light from the Warsaw Uprising Museum and from our museum. And so we've done a number of joint efforts, and they are a very successful museum, really incredibly successful. And they're quite close. They're more or less in the same part of town.
My name is Wojciech Golik, and I'm an honorary consul of the Republic of Poland here in Missouri.
Okay.
And I would like to thank you very much for your very important role in creating this museum. I think this museum is very important for Poland, for Europe, for the rest of the world. A couple of days ago, I went back to the internet site for the museum and read the comments of the visitors. And the reason this museum is so important that many of these visitors mentioned that after visiting the museum, that before they had no idea that the Jews in Poland had such a long and rich history, over 1,000 years. So that's very important that you're part of it, that you brought this idea along with the rest of the organizers to St. Louis, and we have really an opportunity to learn about the fact that there was 1,050 years of history between the Poles and the Jews and other nationalities in that great republic. First Republic of Poland. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. And in fact, just say that one of my goals, and this really relates to your comment, is, you know, in one visit, people don't understand this kind of a museum, like the National Museum of African American History and Culture, is not a 2-hour visit. Normally, the guides say, "Oh, 2 hours is more than enough." These kind of museums is not a 2-hour visit. And even if it's 3 hours, even if it's 6 hours, even if it's 2 or 3 days, and really literally people, and some people in this room have spent the entire day and feel that there's so much more to explore. I would say my modest goal is that when people leave the museum, they leave with that sense that I had no idea of this incredible history, but they leave curious, they leave interested, they also leave better prepared and more confident about exploring this history. Maybe there'll be a film, maybe a book, maybe a lecture, maybe a course. And so I have one of my goals is to, in a sense, launch them on a lifelong interest and with a sort of sensitivity, a kind of, I would say, openness to this story, and for our Jewish visitors and for our Polish visitors and for our international visitors. But I agree, and very often people say, I had no idea. Very, very true.
Hi, I'm Debbie Eidelman. We were just in Poland visiting Warsaw with my husband and my college son. And one of the things that happened was that we had a private tour because we went to see some family items. And I asked them, my grandmother left to South America at the age of 12, so before the war. And she already has passed, and we knew the street she used to live in. And I asked the tour guide where it was that she probably lived with the street name, and she said, you know, the names have changed, they don't exist anymore. It was right there in front of your monument.
Wow.
And when I stood there, and he said, "You're probably standing," because he was right here in the ghetto where she used to live before the ghetto. And it was amazing. And then going in there, we only had 3 hours because we were leaving that day. And we went in there and we saw that. And I just want to thank you because I felt like I was there with her centuries ago.
Thank you very
So
much.
thank you very much. I
Thank
appreciate
you.
it.
Thank you.
Nice note to end on. I know there may be additional questions, but we're running out of time for this room. So what I would encourage is everybody to go out and continue the conversation and enjoy some treats. And thank you again for being here. And please join me in thanking Dr. Kirshenblatt-Gimblett.